to find a discovery of this nature, was, certainly nothing that we expected. A single discovery in Oregon is quietly rewriting everything we know about human history. Buried in the dust of a cave in the south of the state, archaeologists pulled out something so old and so out of place that it should not exist at all. We learn an awful lot about what people were and weren't doing here by the assemblages that we found. So this was, yes, it was a very, very interesting and new kind of sight for me. Older than the pyramids, older than writing, older than every name in every history book you have ever read. They went and inspected and confirmed the story we were all taught about the first Americans. Instead, what they found shattered it. And the deeper they dug, the worse it got for the official version. Here is what they actually uncovered. To understand why Jenkins' little discovery is such a problem, you first have to understand the story it broke. And for most of the last century, that story was simple. The first people set foot in the Americas were the Clovis people, named after a small town in New Mexico where their distinctive stone tools first turned up in the 1930s. Skilled hunters. Their signature weapon was a fluted projectile point, a spear tip with a long groove down the center that made it lighter, sharper, and deadly enough to drop a mammoth. For decades, that point was treated like a fingerprint. Wherever one turned up, Clovis had been there. It was a calling card of the first humans on the continent, and the timeline was just as clean. Around 13,000 years ago, the story went, a small band of hunters crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, slipped south through a narrow ice-free corridor that had only just opened between the retreating glaciers, and spread out across a continent full of giant animals and untouched forest. Now, picture how recent that actually is. 13,000 years ago, the Great Pyramids were still 8,000 years from being built. Writing did not exist anywhere on Earth. In the official version, the entire human story of 2 whole continents fits inside that one narrow window, and everyone believed it. It was printed in textbooks, taught in classrooms, and defended fiercely by the most respected names in American archaeology. Careers were built on that timeline. Reputations depended on it being true. Then, a groundhog ruined everything. The trouble started at a place called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, about 7 miles upstream from the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, under a thick overhang of sandstone that had been keeping travelers dry for thousands of years. Warm, sheltered, close to water. For thousands of years, hunters and wanderers had ducked under that ledge to wait out the rain, never imagining they were pressing a record into the dirt beneath their feet. One archaeologist later called it the prehistoric Holiday Inn. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller was walking that property when he noticed a groundhog had been busy, kicking up fresh soil from its burrow. Something in the loose dirt caught his eye. Curious, Miller knelt down, worked his hand into the groundhog hole, and pulled out something that stopped him cold. Ancient artifacts. Objects that had no business, sitting in the topsoil of a quiet Pennsylvania hillside. He turned them over in his palm, a man who had spent his life around local history, knowing in his gut that this was older than anything that belonged here. And then Miller did something remarkable for an amateur. He told almost no one, covered the spot back over, and waited for years for the right people to come and do it properly. It took 18 years for those people to arrive. In 1973, an archaeologist named Jim Adavaggio climbed down into that shelter and began cutting into the floor, peeling back the dirt one paper-thin layer at a time. He ran the dig like a surgeon, every grain mapped, every flake logged, because he could already feel something building under his trowel. Each layer was another chapter of human history, and the deeper down he went, the older those chapters became. Then the radiocarbon results came back, and the numbers weren't just surprising. They were a problem. Humans had been at Meadowcroft as early as 16,000 to 19,000 calibrated years ago, several thousand years before Clovis was ever supposed to have set foot on the continent. Adavaggio knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew exactly how much trouble it was about to cause him. In 1980, he published it in American Antiquity, one of the most respected journals in the field, and he said it flat out. The Clovis first model was wrong. The reaction was immediate, and it was ugly. Critics swarmed the dates. Maybe ancient coal in the soil had contaminated the samples, they said. Maybe groundwater had thrown off the carbon. Some refused to even look at the data. And Adavajo dug in, spending years, then decades, defending dirt he had measured with his own hands against colleagues who had never once stood in his trench. He watched his site get waved off at conference after conference. Researchers eventually gave the stubbornness a name, Clovis primacy syndrome, and called its continued defense atavistic and futile. But here's the thing. While the whole field was busy screaming at each other over whether humans showed up 12,000 or 16,000 years ago, nobody was watching the dust quietly settling in a dry cave system 2,000 miles to the west. The real bomb was never in Pennsylvania. It was in Oregon, the Oregon Cave. Before we climb back into that Oregon cave with the archaeologists who found it, a University of Oregon researcher named Dennis Jenkins, you need to know something, because what he pulled out of the dirt is only the first thread. There are 4 more sites coming in this video, and one of them pushes the timeline back so far. It accidentally points to an entirely different species of humans standing on this continent. If a buried truth that big is the kind of thing you follow all the way down, take a second and subscribe, because from here it only gets stranger. And the real route the first Americans took doesn't come clear until the very last chapter. Okay, back to Oregon. The caves are called the Paisley Caves, tucked into a dry, dusty stretch of high desert in south-central Oregon. The landscape is bone-dry. Wind cuts across the sagebrush. Nothing rots quickly in ground like this. And that single fact is exactly why this site became one of the most important discoveries on the entire continent. Picture the way Jenkins saw it. The air inside is cold and still. The walls are strewn with dust. Under your feet is soft, ash-like sediment no one has stirred in over 14,000 years. Every centimeter down is another step backward in time. And somewhere just below the surface is the thing that ends a 100-year-old argument. It is not a spear point. It is not a fire pit. It is not a buried skeleton. It is human waste, dried, fossilized, completely undisturbed for thousands of years. I know how that sounds, but inside those small, unassuming chunks of ancient feces was something more valuable than any stone tool ever made. Human DNA, preserved by the dry desert air, locked inside cells that survived the millennia almost perfectly intact. When the scientists extracted the mitochondrial DNA and sequenced it, the result hit like a hammer. The genetic material matched the Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. They matched. These were not strangers passing through, not some dead-end population that vanished without descendants. They were direct ancestors of modern indigenous peoples, real relatives of people alive on this continent today. To pin down the age, researchers use accelerator mass spectrometry, which dates the organic material directly without leaning on a rock and dirt around it. The calibrated result came back at over 14,000 years before the present. To put that in plain terms, that is roughly 4,000 years before the city of Jericho and 6,000 years before the first writing anywhere on Earth. The Clovis people, the ones who were supposed to be first, wouldn't arrive for another 1,000 years after these people had already lived and died in Oregon. One cave, one sample, and the wall already had a crack running straight up the middle of it. But a single date, however clean, can always be argued with. So the next site didn't just add to Jenkins' number. It sealed it in stone, literally, a volcanic clock, about 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, just outside the small town of Riley in Harney County, sits another Oregon site that quietly tore a second hole in the Clovis story. It's called Rimrock Drawer Rock Shelter, and the excavation began in 2011, led by University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady. This site wasn't handing over DNA. It was giving up something just as powerful. Stone tools, animal bone, and a natural clock written in volcanic ash. Running through the dirt like a chalk line drawn across time was a thin white layer. O'Grady's team identified it as fallout from a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. Everything above that line was younger. Everything below it was older. A volcano more than 1,000 miles away had stamped a perfect timestamp into the Oregon soil and left it there for them to find. And below that timestamp, things got strange. The team pulled out around 27 fragments of tooth enamel. Small, unremarkable pieces, but the story they told was enormous. One belonged to yesterday's camel, a species that roamed North America during the last ice age. Another belonged to Bison antiquus, a massive, heavy-shouldered ancestor of the modern buffalo. Both had been extinct for thousands of years. And here they were, lying together, sealed under ash that fell long before any pyramid was raised. Then O'Grady found the tool. In the same layer sat a stone scraper of orange chalcedony, a kind of agate that catches a light like burnished copper. He turned it over in his hand. Multiple working edges. A curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, a saw-toothed edge worn smooth from years of use. He later compared it to an early Swiss Army knife. Hold that picture. A single hand-shaped tool polished smooth by daily use, dropped into the dirt of an Oregon cave by a person who never imagined they would become the only proof they ever existed. And here's where the timeline cracked wide open. The tool sat about 10 centimeters below the camel teeth, which meant it was older than the animals. And when those animal remains were finally tested, they came back at roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years old. 22,000 years. That is the height of the last ice age, when most of Canada was buried under a sheet of ice nearly 2 miles thick. The ice-free corridor those Clovis hunters supposedly walked through wouldn't exist for another 7,000 years. And yet someone was already standing in Oregon butchering camels. O'Grady said himself, "It was terrifying to be holding a single date, that old. You don't say a number like that out loud without something solid under it." But he didn't have one date. He had 2 independent tests, both landing on the same impossible result. So if the people leaving these tools weren't Clovis, who on earth were they? Wrong hands. The tools coming out of Rimrock, draw it and look anything like Clovis points. They belong to a completely different tradition that archaeologists call the Western stem tradition. Projectile points with long, narrow blades, weak shoulders, and rounded bases. To you or me, they might look like just another old rock, but to a trained eye, the difference is night and day. If Clovis points were spears built for raw power, Western stem points were built by an entirely different mind. Think about what that actually means. Different hands, different traditions, brought from a different place, and they show up in the record thousands of years before any notched Clovis point ever did. That one detail collapses the whole logic of the Clovis first model, because you cannot be the first if someone else was already here, leaving completely different tools in the dirt. So who were they? Whoever made these tools wasn't Clovis. They were something older, a people whose name we don't know, whose language is gone, whose journey across the world we are only just starting to trace. By the time Rimrock Drawer reached publication, the Clovis first model was already on life support, but the next 2 discoveries weren't even aiming at Clovis anymore. They were aiming at something much bigger, the very idea of when modern humans first set foot on these continents at all: footprints in ice. In 2009, researchers at White Sands National Park in New Mexico started noticing strange impressions in the dry gypsum of an ancient lake bed. The park is famous for its endless white dunes, a place that looks almost lunar, but under that quiet surface was a record nobody expected to find. As they brushed the dust away, the shapes became unmistakable. Footprints, 61 of them, left by people walking the shore of an Ice Age lake called Lake Otero. You could see individual toes, the arch of a foot, even a little skid where someone shifted their weight mid-stride. Stop and stand in one of those prints for a second in your mind. It's a real footprint made by a real person the same size as your own. Not a legend, not a theory, a kid or a parent or a hunter walking barefoot along a lake that no longer exists. When the first dating attempt came in 2021, scientists used radiocarbon on seeds from a plant called spiral ditch grass found in the same layers. The results came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That alone should have ended the debate. But the pushback was instant and familiar. Maybe the seeds had soaked up old carbon from groundwater, the critics said. Maybe the dates were inflated by thousands of years. It was the exact same argument Adavajo had weathered decades earlier at Meadowcroft. So the team tested again. This time, conifer pollen from the same layers. Pollen doesn't pull carbon from groundwater. It comes straight from living plants. The result came back identical, 21,000 to 23,000 years. Then, In June 2025, a third study in Science Advances tested organic material from wetland mud and shallow lake sediment. Pollen, seeds, and mud. Three separate sources, all landing on the same window. The height of the last ice age, a time when northern North America was supposedly sealed under impassable ice and humans were supposedly nowhere near this continent. 23,000 years is so far back it's hard to hold in your head. Stonehenge wouldn't be built for another 18,000 years. People were only just starting to paint the cave walls of Lascaux, and those footprints didn't walk alone. Pressed into the same dried lake bed are the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths. People and giants crossing the same wet sand, leaving their stories side by side. 23,000 years felt like the edge of believable. Then a freeway crew in Southern California hit something that made 23,000 years look young. The bones nobody wants. It started as a routine freeway project in Southern California. Workers were digging when their machinery struck bone. Everything stopped. Paleontologists were called in, and as they cleared the earth, they realized the bones belonged to a single mastodon, a huge elephant-like animal that died out at the end of the Ice Age. The place became known as the Cheruti Mastodon Site. But the bones weren't just lying there. Something had been done to them. They showed spiral fractures, a specific kind of break that only happens when bone is still fresh and green. Fossilized bone doesn't break that way. It crumbles. It shatters. These have been snapped while still alive with marrow, cracked open on purpose to get at the food inside. It's the exact pattern early humans used all over the world to pull marrow from large prey. And there was more. Scattered among the bones were 5 heavy cobbles, fist-sized rocks that geologists confirmed could not have washed them by water. Too heavy. They had been carried to the spot deliberately and used as hammerstones and anvils. Something with intelligence had worked these bones. Something set up here, butchered this animal, and walked away, leaving the evidence in the dirt. Then came the dating. Researchers used uranium-thorium analysis, one of the most reliable methods for material this old, and every test landed in the same place. The bones were around 130,700 years old. 130,000 years. Sit with that. That is more than 10 times older than Clovis. It is older than the oldest known cave painting on the planet. When these bones were being smashed open in California, our own species, Homo sapiens, had barely even left Africa. The study was published in Nature in 2017, and it made an extraordinary claim. Some kind of human was in North America at that time. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals, something else, something nobody could name, and the mainstream largely refuses to touch it. Too radical, too uncomfortable. It fits no model anyone has ever built. Some argue the cobbles were crushed by natural forces, even though the geologists ruled that out. Others just quietly avoid citing the paper at all. But the bones are still there. The stones are still there. The dates haven't moved, which drags us back to the question hanging over this whole story. If humans were already here that long ago, where on earth did they come from? For decades, the answer was Siberia. They were wrong. And the truth involves an ocean crossing that should not have been possible. A crossing by sea. The textbook always insisted the first Americans walked. They crossed Beringia, the land bridge that joined Asia to Alaska when sea levels were low, and stepped onto a continent no human had ever touched. One people, one route, one arrival. But the new evidence is forcing scientists towards something that used to be unthinkable. What if some of the first Americans never walked at all? What if they came by boat? And what if the journey started not in Siberia, but far to the south along the coast of China? The first clue that ancient humans could even cross open water came from an island in the Mediterranean called Crete. Crete has been an island for about 5 million years, never once connected to any mainland in the entire time humans have existed, which means every single person who ever set foot there had to arrive by boat, not a raft drifting off course, a real purpose-built vessel crossing at least 40 miles of open sea. This is where 2 researchers come in, Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou, working 2 sites on the rocky coast of Crete. They kept pulling stone tools out of ground where no tools were supposed to exist. And when the dates came back, they landed somewhere between 130,000 and 700,000 years old. The tools resembled those made by Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, ancient ancestors who lived long before modern humans existed. Stand in their shoes for a second. They were holding proof that our distant cousins were building seaworthy boats hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought it was possible. As one of the team put it, if early humans could cross water before 130,000 years ago, they could cross other water too. And just like that, the Pacific stopped being a wall. It became a highway. Then genetics added the twist. Scientists tracing a mitochondrial DNA lineage called D4H followed it back to coastal China. And instead of one migration into the Americas, the lineage had arrived by two separate pathways, two waves thousands of years apart, both leading back to the same ancient homeland on the Chinese coast. And this is where that question from the very start of the video finally pays off. The first Americans didn't come from where the textbook said. They didn't all walk, and the route was nothing anyone expected. The first wave came roughly 26,000 years ago. They likely traveled by boat, hugging the coast from China up through Japan and along the Pacific Rim. No land bridge required. They had boats, and they followed the shoreline, camp by camp, living off the sea as they went. That route has a name now. The Kelp Highway, a continuous green corridor of marine life running along the Pacific edge from Asia all the way to the Americas. The second wave came around 15,000 years ago. These were the ones who took the land route across Beringia, the people usually tied to later migrations, including the Clovis tradition, the very people we once crowned as the first Americans. Turns out they were the latecomers, walking a path others had already mapped by sea thousands of years before. And the clincher is sitting in the stone itself. The same blade styles, the same flake patterns show up in China and Japan and in the Americas. Tools from opposite sides of the Pacific. So alike they could have been made by the same hands. That isn't coincidence. It's a trail, and it leads straight back across the ocean to the rocky coast of ancient China. Older than we thought. So look at what one discovery in an Oregon cave set loose. The Clovis people weren't first. The land bridge wasn't the only door, and the timeline of human arrival in the Americas may run back not thousands of years past the textbooks, but tens of thousands. Every test keeps confirming it. The DNA at Paisley Caves, the Swiss Army knife at Rimrock Draw with the volcanic ash sealing it in place, the footprint at White Sands, the shattered mastodon bones in California, the coastal genetics pointing back to China. Each one a separate thread, and each thread pulling the old story